Welcome to another edition of the Mail Time Podcast. This episode might be called Heart of a Hypocrite. I am looking again at Angela Buchdahl's previous commentary, this time from 2019. Again, she has refused to come out and condemn Zoran Mamdani's anti-Semitism and his failure to truly stand up to the anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic movement. I want to first start by saying I went to Gann Academy in Waltham, Massachusetts. The woke right, please stop your ridiculous games. You cannot out-woke me with language. I might not agree with you, but you certainly can not pull a fast one on me with your insane games, okay? I do not care about Angela Buchdahl's Korean heritage. It means absolutely nothing to me. I don't actually care if her mother's Jewish, her father's Jewish. I don't care. I'm evaluating her ideas. So we are discussing the ideas. And I think her ideas are horrible. I also think she has a horrific double standard. So when they claim that there is no politics in shul, synagogue, whatever you want to call it, and that it's just a spiritual home for everyone, this is a complete lie. It's hypocritical, and I want to prove that here. So all the other stuff, don't tell me what someone said in the comment section. It's not essential at all to the discussion. Let's get going.
So it's so good to be home. Thank you for all the happy greetings along the way. I'm back from a month of studying and learning at the Hartman Institute, where the topic for the month was Jewish peoplehood and nationalism. It's not a surprise, perhaps, that this is something they wanted to talk about, because it feels like nationalism is a little bit under attack. And the Hartman Institute is an unapologetically Zionist institution, and I think they wanted to make the case for nationalism. So it's not just a theoretical exercise. And as it turns out, it's been very much a part of the talk around the globe. Now, nationalism, you could see it as good or bad, depending on your definition. And I'm going to start with a relatively value-neutral definition of nationalism, which is...
First of all, you're in synagogue, and all of a sudden you're talking about nationalism. So when you talk about having political ideas, whether it's good or bad, I'm not actually judging her ideas here. You are talking about nationalism. So you are talking about nationalism. Inherent to that discussion is something political.
Nationalism at its core advocates for loyalty and devotion and identification with one's own nation and support of its interests, including prioritization of some of those interests over others. So that doesn't seem particularly controversial, and we understand why that might be important. There's a benefit to membership and citizenship. In order to have a sense of identity and belonging and safety, you sometimes need to prioritize your needs over the needs of other people. And this is understandable. We all do this in some way or another with whatever our units are. It's very simple and easy to imagine that with your family that you would prioritize the needs of your children over other people. In fact, it might almost seem wrong not to do that. But this question of prioritization is a tricky one. When does prioritization become discrimination of others? There are some people who would argue that you can't prioritize without discriminating.
Notice that the connotation of discrimination here is inherently negative, at least in this definition, right? If you were to say that you're going to spend 3 hours with your neighbor's child on their homework, but you're not going to help your own child, and you are discriminating against your child, I mean, this is just nonsense. It's not discrimination to say I'm going to prioritize my kid's education over the education of my neighbor if I have limited amount of time, and this is what I'm able to do in my day. But notice that she's immediately just introducing these radical definitions that immediately condemn whoever supports this cause as in violation of Jewish law, Jewish ethics, as she says, and just a bad person.
So it was fascinating to have this conversation in Israel, which is a modern nation state built on an ethnic nationalism. And I never really thought about the ways that an ethnic national identity, which necessarily prioritizes Jewish culture and values and language and symbols over others, might play out in a society where not everyone is Jewish. For example,
I just want to roll that back 1 second. Keep in mind, this is 2019. She's been the rabbi, I think, since 2014.
Prioritizes conversation in Israel, which is a modern nation state built on an ethnic nationalism. And I never really thought about the ways that...
I'm not even going to address that part in the complexities of all of the different types of Jews, but just let that go for 1 second.
An ethnic national identity, which necessarily prioritizes Jewish culture and values and language and symbols over others, might play out in a society.
I actually cut that too short. Let's go back 30 seconds here.
But this question of prioritization is a tricky one. When does prioritization become discrimination of others? There are some people who would argue that you can't prioritize without discriminating. So it was fascinating to have this conversation in Israel, which is a modern nation state built on an ethnic nationalism. And I never really thought about the ways that an ethnic...
So she never really thought about the ways that a Jewish state would interact with its non-Jewish citizens. This is 2019. She's been the leader of this congregation for 5 years at this point. She considers herself a leader of the Jewish community. And she talks about Israel incessantly and talks about how important it is. And before she took her month trip to the Hartman Institute, she never really thought about how Israel might interact with its citizens. Keep in mind that in other speeches, she talks about protesting in the streets. It's very bizarre.
National identity, which necessarily prioritizes Jewish culture and values and language and symbols over others, might play out in a society where not everyone is Jewish. For example, I spoke with an Arab Palestinian Israeli citizen. He is one of the 21% of Israeli citizens who are Israeli Arabs. And he says, I'm very happy and proud to be an Israeli citizen, but it's hard to have my country's national anthem be Hatikva, which speaks of the 2,000-year-old dream to be a free people in our own land.
She's literally bringing up a point that Mayor Kahana mentioned incessantly. Love him or hate him, that's a point that Mayor Kahana brought up incessantly. He said, if you have an ethnic minority that does not appreciate Hatikva and doesn't appreciate the core values of the country, that this might be a problem. Now, I mention this because the reform movement, of course, will brand Kahana as some sort of racist bigot that's way over the line. Okay? And then simultaneously, Angela Buchdahl is now bringing an example of exactly what Mayor Kahana mentioned as an essential truth. I don't think she even realizes it because, as she just said, she had never really considered what it's like to have ethnic minority in Israel.
Says, that's what I'm supposed to sing, to be a free people in my own land. So apparently it's actually still a debate among...
Apparently, Mayor Kahana was saying this in the 70s. I'm bringing this up to just say that there's so much ignorance and hypocrisy coming from this podium. I don't think she even realizes it. Because the echo chamber, the Democratic Party echo chamber at Central Synagogue, is so strong that I don't think that leadership even realizes how insane the echo chamber truly is.
Some about whether or not Hatikva should remain the national anthem of Israel. When does prioritization become discrimination? And of course, this conversation goes way beyond just symbolic things like a flag or with a Jewish star on it or the national anthem. And while minority groups in Israel, like the Arab population, they have a right to vote, they have a right to learn their language and their culture. Even their imams and Christian ministers are paid for by the state, just like the rabbis are, at least the Orthodox rabbis are. But there are many other ways that the ethnic nationalism can...
It's a nice dig at the establishment. Again, she's not political. Remember, that's the standard. It's a spiritual home for all, not political.
sometimes discriminate against them, including, for example, that most Israeli Arabs are not allowed to fight in the Israeli Defense Force, in the IDF, in the army.
Just not true. It's just not true. There's a background check to make sure that there are people that are not enemies of the state, that they're allowed to fight in the IDF. I don't know where she's coming up with this.
And that comes with a lot of social and professional and even economic benefits afterwards.
So now the state of Israel is waging a war against its Arab minority because it won't let them tap into the social, economic, and other benefits by fighting in the IDF. Again, this is made up.
Now, historically, we Jews, we know what it's like to be an ethnic minority in a majority that is not ours. We have lived in countries that have a Christian symbol on its flag. We've lived under extreme oppression and discrimination, and we know what it is to be a minority within an ethnic majority culture that is not ours.
Just a point of clarity, there's many examples of Jews having great lives in the minority status. There's also, unfortunately, a lot of blood and bloodshed with countries that have the same principles, but it's not as if the essence of being a minority is inherently discriminatory. That's where the big problem comes. And this is part of the Democratic Party attack on the religious attitudes within America, because Jews in America can have a wonderful life. And yes, people might say, Merry Christmas, or there might be a Christmas tree in the White House. I do not care. I do care, sorry. I care. I think it's a good thing. It's a good thing for people to be tapped into religion. But the way that it's framed here by Angela Buchdahl is essentially promoting and encouraging some sort of minority status that is inherently bad.
So we know what it's like to sometimes feel like their culture is prioritized and we're discriminated against. But
the prioritization of a culture is not inherently discriminatory in the way that she's using it. I don't need the President of the United States to put on tefillin. It's good that he goes to church. I'm happy about that. It's not discriminatory.
The line between prioritization and discrimination seems to be the line between when nationalism truly becomes something different, like ultranationalism or even fascism. I would describe that definition as when you embrace your race or your nation, and that legitimates the exclusion, discrimination, and even the oppression of other people. So when I think of the...
Are you ready? Because this would be the worst thing. You would be oppressing people. You would be like King Paro in Egypt. This is the moral authority of Angela Buchdahl, apolitical Angela Buchdahl, coming down and talking about the evil people of our time, the people who use ethnic nationalism for oppression. And let's see who she happens to question if they're part of this group.
Global leaders who identify with nationalism today: Viktor Orban, Marine Le Pen, Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump, Benjamin Netanyahu. Which ones are crossing that line?
Oh, so who's crossing the line? We're not sure. We're going to investigate from the podium, whether it's the sitting leader of Israel, whether it's the President of the United States, European people. We're just going to have a discussion about it. But remember, Central Synagogue is apolitical.
One definition I also heard about how you might tell the difference between nationalism and ultranationalism, which becomes much more dangerous, is that nationalism sees the primary threat as being something external, whereas ultranationalists actually see the primary threat as coming from within. The fellow citizens who might threaten the purity of your nationalist cause.
Now, this is a typical leftist talking point. Again, This is where there's a lot of nuance in the conversation, and they love to hide behind straw man arguments. Let's take America, for example. Okay? If you had a group that were to get up there and say that America is inherently evil, inherently terrible, and that the national anthem needs to be changed, that there needs to be reparations, and that white people are evil, all these things, right? You can object to that and say that that's a threat from within, more of a threat than, say, China. And that's not ultra-nationalist. That's defending the ideals of America. But the way that the conversation is framed is such that you are now an ultra-nationalist and an evil, immoral person for trying to defend the principles of the country. You see how sick and twisted this is? It's not a real conversation. And this is not some sort of purity. You can have disagreements. You can have disagreements between Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals, not leftists. But when you push this hard left progressivism into what it means to make any sort of judgment, you are necessitating a moral condemnation of your ideological opponent before you even enter the discussion.
In this week's Torah portion, we are actually introduced to the first Israelite ultra-nationalist. His name is Pinchas, son of Eleazar. So this story started last week with Parshat Balak, where the Midianite king, he wants to turn the Israelites to his god, Peor. And so he does this by sending Midianite women to seduce the Israelite men and bring them to his god. And this angers God, so God brings a plague on the Israelites. Now our story picks up this week in Parshat Pinchas, where we see an Israelite man flagrantly taking a Midianite woman in front of Moses and all the other Israelites into his tent to consort with her. And Pinchas takes a spear, follows after them into the chamber, stabs them both in the belly, and kills them. And then the plague stops. So it's interesting that Pinchas doesn't go after the Midianite king. He doesn't see the Midianite king as the threat or the Midianite people as the threat. He sees his own Israelites who were doing these things as the real threat, and he goes after them.
Instead of only blaming people of which you really don't have any expectation to begin with, you look within in people that received divine law and are bringing sexual immorality into Israel, and clearly Hashem responds with seeming approval. Again, I don't even want to go into some of these theological inversions, but it's just interesting how they rewrite the Torah to meet their modern leftist agenda. So she's taking the Torah and offering it on a platter to people like Barack Obama so that they can then use it as a tool to smash traditional religious thinking. Just calling a spade here.
He is an ultra-nationalist.
I'll just say he's not an ultra-nationalist. This is insane.
And we see this ultra-nationalism in the different ways that it can play out in the world today. And I was thinking about how did this play out also in Israel. The most extreme example is one that I experienced when I lived in Israel over 20 years ago, which was the ultra-nationalist, ultra-Orthodox Jew named Yigal Amir, who assassinated Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in the name of trying to save his country.
Do you notice that she just brought Yigal Amir, Yamach Shemo, into the conversation, contrasting him and likening him to Pinchas? I'm really trying to stay away from some of the theological things because there's a big issue that goes well beyond the scope of this podcast right now. But in the sense that I'm not interested in asking whether or not I agree with much of what the Reform movement says. It's not about that in terms of how they view the Torah and how they view God. This is not relevant to this podcast. I'm only calling out the hypocrisy. But you notice that she's now taking the Torah and using it as a cudgel to take the most extreme example of, frankly, a terrorist and a lunatic, Yigal Amir, murdering Yitzhak Rabin, and almost normalizing him to then use him to oppose people that believe in nationalism in the state of Israel. Yigal Amir is not representative of Benjamin Netanyahu. He's not representative of the normative thinking when it comes to nationalism in Israel, nor is he like the nationalism that a Donald Trump would promote. But what she's doing is subtly bringing him into the mainstream, using the Torah from the other direction, and then saying, if you don't agree with this, you're a moral bigot.
We see it with the ultra-Orthodox rabbinate, which dictates all matter of personal status and constantly challenges not the external folks, but challenges Jewish ancestry and legitimacy of fellow Israeli citizens and Jews around the world.
So the rabbinate in Israel, which is concerned with halacha, and again, I'm not defending the rabbinate or the politicization of the rabbinate, okay? This is a whole Megillah. I could bring on 3 scholars and talk about this for a week, and we wouldn't cover everything, okay? But you notice that she just brought in Yigal Amir and then likens him to Pinchas and then likens him to the ultra-Orthodox. And the rabbis are concerned with rabbinical things. The serious rabbis, I should say. Forget the rabbinate for 1 second. Talking about serious thinkers. This is 2019, right? Chaim Kanievsky's focused on Jewish issues, right? So she's now basically saying that you are a moral bigot if you agree with traditional Jewish thinking. But again, she's not political.
Now, this is not just a story that's happening in Israel, as you know. It was quite fascinating as we were studying nationalism in Israel to hear about what was happening and playing out in the news right here in America over the last couple of weeks. It made all of us on the program think to ourselves, can nationalism be redeemed? Is this just a problematic ideology today? Well, I sure hope so. And I think that one of the reasons I feel this is from my own personal story. Because you see, I was born in a very nationalist country, which is South Korea. They're very proud and very loyal Koreans. It is an ethnic nationalism, which means it's based on the fact that Koreans all share a certain common identity, heritage, genetic makeup, history, all of that. So it feels in some ways much easier to bond with an ethnic nationalism unless you don't fully belong to that ethnicity. And so one of the reasons actually that my own parents left Korea is this hermit kingdom, which had a very kind of isolationist policy in a way. It was all fine and good if you were actually full-blooded Korean, but if you were a half-breed like me, it was actually very hard to feel like you could belong. And in fact, in some ways, there was much more prejudice against children from mixed-race families than even complete foreigners who were seen as not as much a threat. So part of the reason that this is why my parents came to America. My father was a very proud American. He served in the armed forces, which is what brought him to Korea in the first place. And America obviously celebrates a nationalism too, but this is a civic nationalism, which means a nationalism that's not based on your ethnicity or where you come from, but on your embrace of a shared set of values, of religious freedom and justice and liberty for all, democratic ideals of promise, of opportunity for all people. Whoever embraced and upheld these values, you could become fully American. At least that was the ideal. And we don't always live up to that, but I still believe it's deeply possible. I was asked to be in an interview in which we talked about the fact of having 2 homelands, that just 100 years ago, the Jews didn't even have necessarily one real home. And now we have 2 real homes that...
Okay, I just have to push back on this. The Jews always had a homeland in the land of Israel. She's talking about the modern state of Israel. But that's just not, it's conflating a whole bunch of ideas here.
Feel like very strong basis for Jewish life, and that's Israel and America. And Tal Becker was interviewing me for this conversation, and he said, "So why is America home for you?" And I said, "Well, as a patrilineal Jew who is a female Reform rabbi," I said, "I don't think I could be the Jew that I am anywhere but in America." And I said, "That's why this is my home." And there's something amazing and beautiful about the civic nationalism that allows this flourishing that really hasn't ever happened anywhere else in Jewish history.
I just want to ask if that's an indictment of Jewish history, or is that subtly an indictment of what the reform movement is doing in America? That's a question. I'm asking that as a podcast host, just to consider. Notice her framing is just very myopic.
And it's still not actually the case. I couldn't be the Jew I am today in Israel, which is sort of a sad statement. So I think that the worry is...
I wish she would go into more about why that's a sad statement. Just to actually just go, instead of just saying that these people are like Yigal Amir and the ultra-nationalist evil Pinchas, have a discussion about it.
When nationalism kind of deteriorates into either this ultranationalism, fascism, or an extreme tribalism, Albert Einstein once called nationalism the measles of mankind. But rather than being our pathology, I think it can be our antidote to the ills of our modern life. As long as we fight the violent extremist strains that are within nationalism, America has been one of the greatest experiments in civic nationalism that ever existed. E pluribus unum, from all the many, one, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. In our best moments, America has been nationalism at its best, and I strongly believe that this ideal is still worth fighting for. Pinchas, the ultranationalist.
Worth fighting for, except if the candidate for New York City is an open anti-Semite, then she can't say anything because there's no politics in the synagogue. Keep that in mind.
Was rewarded by God with a covenant of peace for his extreme violent action. And many rabbinic commentators over the centuries who abhorred this act that he did explained that it was not a gift. It was not a reward for Pinchas, but it was rather God's attempt at mitigating and redirecting Pinchas's extreme nationalism that had gone awry, to give him a sense of peace so that he would actually be more whole and less violent. We know that nationalism needs to have checks and balances against them, mitigating forces, so that actually it can be a force for peace, not for violence.
You need violence to have peace in any real way. That is basic military and nationalist doctrine throughout the centuries. So what she's actually proposing is upside down, backwards, asinine. As if, for example, Israel wants to be violent. Israel does not want to be violent. America does not want to be violent. No sane, rational, Western-aligned country wants to send its sons and daughters to be violent. But notice here, she's saying, bringing in all these ahistorical examples and saying that, oh, we just need peace, not violence. That's not the juxtaposition. That's not an authentic juxtaposition. This is a straw man argument of nonsense.
So may our nationalism be in the name of the covenant of peace for our own country and for all other nations. Amen.
Keep in mind that this leader has said she cannot come out and condemn Zoran Mamdani because it's a spiritual home for all and that there's no place or presence for politics in this synagogue, after she just gave a 12.5-minute ahistorical diatribe about nationalism in which she is looping in Putin, Trump, Benjamin Netanyahu, Yigal Amir, the ultra-Orthodox as Fox News would say, we report, you decide. Do you think this is really an apolitical synagogue?